Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. In this workshop, we bring in scholars from across the country to present their research and engage in a discussion with the NDSU community. Topics focus on innovation, opportunity, and ways to increase individual and societal flourishing. I'm really excited today that we're joined by Dr. Noah Dormady. And Noah Dormady is an award-winning economist and public policy professor at The Ohio State University. He specializes in energy and environmental policy and economics, economic resilience to natural hazards, risk and decision analysis, and applied public policy analysis. Dormady's research evaluates the relationship between government regulation and markets, for example, electricity markets and carbon markets, and how the design of markets for critical infrastructure impacts society. His research also evaluates how businesses are affected by disruptions to critical infrastructure that occur in disasters, and what those businesses can do to cost-effectively bounce back. Similarly, his research also evaluates how decision makers of all types respond to disruptions, disasters, and government regulations, market designs, and policies. And again, I'm really excited that we're talking about economic resilience. I think it's a very important topic. And I'm really excited that we had somebody come from The Ohio State University. I like to say that. We have to say the. And anyway, so again, would everyone please welcome Dr. Noah Dormady.
Well, it's a privilege to be here. As he mentioned, I'm Noah Dormady from Ohio State University. And we can just say, we don't have to say the in front of The Ohio State University, although I think there was a court case about that. In any event, it's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be able to talk with you about resilience and what resilience means for businesses. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our empirical work, some of our research, focusing on how we actually quantify and measure resilience, what resilience is and what resilience isn't. And oftentimes, what resilience isn't is a little bit more controversial than what resilience actually is. But it's a pleasure to be here. I teach undergraduates a lot at Ohio State. How many of you are undergraduates? Just a show of hands. Okay, great, great. I teach our undergraduate policy analysis course. And each year I have about 50 to 100 students, some of the really sharp students in our college, and they look very much like you guys. So thank you for coming to the talk and for your interest in this topic today. Just a quick show of hands among the folks here who are students. How many of you have aspirations of one day owning or running a business? Want to run your own business? Wow, it's quite a show of hands. Okay, great. Let me ask you, how many of you own or run a business now or have a family business? Okay, a few of you. Well, this talk is definitely for you guys. We're going to be talking today about what businesses experience in disasters. And I want you to be thinking about what it would be like for your business, the business that you plan to own or operate one day, what it would be like for your business if you were hit by a major catastrophic event. Maybe it would be a hurricane. Maybe it'd be a wildfire. Maybe it'd be a major flood. Maybe it'd be a tornado, right? I want you to think about what would happen to your business if you were impacted by a major disaster. And I'd like you to think for a minute just about what would happen with your business in terms of the types of inputs that your business needs to run and to operate on a daily basis. You're going to have inputs to things like labor. You're going to have employees. You're going to have inputs to capital. You're going to have machinery and equipment that you use to produce your goods or your services. And I want you to think about what that disaster, what that type of hazard would do to how you use those inputs, how it would influence and affect your business in terms of how effectively and efficiently you use your inputs. I am affiliated with 2 U.S. Department of Homeland Security centers. The Homeland Security, U.S. Department of Homeland Security has these models called COEs, or Centers of Excellence. And I was affiliated originally, where I did my PhD at USC, with the CREATE Center. And it started as the Center for Risk and the Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events, or CREATE. And it was founded right after Homeland Security became a became a department after 9/11. And their mission was to study terrorism and the impacts of disruptions like 9/11 on our economy and on our critical infrastructure. And I got into this field after I started working at that center and doing research on things like terrorism. I started doing research on things like, anthrax attacks and biohazard events, and what that would do to things like the housing market. And about 8 years ago, I was really lucky to be part of a team that started another center of excellence at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Institute, or CIRI. And CIRI was one of the newest centers of excellence devoted, as the name suggests, to critical infrastructure. The University of Illinois is one of our nation's leading computer science programs and one of our nation's leading cybersecurity centers. And CIRI is focused to a great degree on cyber protection. And on the other side, they have another core mission, and that's the resilience of our businesses, the resilience of small and mid-sized businesses, and what we can do to help those businesses bounce back and recover after they're hit by major disasters. And this is a core focus of Homeland Security. Homeland Security isn't, they're not just the folks who screen you at the airport. Homeland Security also does things like business resilience, and it's a big function of what they do. Another important agency, another important federal agency for businesses after disasters is the Small Business Administration. And the Small Business Administration some years ago put out a study, if I can get this opened, put out a study, and they said the results of their study were that after a disaster, among small businesses that are hit by that disaster, 3/4 of them do not reopen after they're hit by a disaster. I'd like you to think about that number for a second. 75% of businesses, small businesses that are hit by a disaster, don't reopen. They're not prepared for that disruption. They're not prepared for the things that you guys are starting to think about. What would happen to your business if you were hit by a disaster? Now, there's some debate about whether or not that number is accurate, whether or not it's 75%. There's other studies that say it's 50 and other studies that say it's 90%. And I don't want to get into the merits of which one is the right number, which one's the wrong number. But the point is that that number is not trivial. It's a significant portion. It's a large percentage of small businesses. When they're hit by a disaster, they don't bounce back. They don't recover. They don't have resilience. And in part, what happens to small businesses and mid-sized businesses, the focus of my research, after disasters, they do things that they think will be effective. They pursue a course of action that they think is going to be cost effective to them, that's going to help them get back on their feet after they faced a big disruption, but it ends up not working. They do what they think is going to be cost effective, what they think is going to be effective, and they end up going out of business. Because let's face it, they don't have experience with disasters. They do what they think is going to work, but it would be helpful for them to know what experiences of other businesses just like theirs were that helped those businesses succeed, or in some cases to even learn from the failures of businesses that didn't succeed. And part of my research is devoted to that very mission, to making sure that businesses can learn from the lived experiences of other businesses and disasters to help them understand how to bounce back, to help them understand what other businesses did that worked and what other businesses did that didn't work, and to be able to take that and harness that knowledge and use it for empirical analytics. Let's go back and revisit, though, that question of what would happen to your business, the types of disasters or disruptions that you would face. And let's see if I can get this clicking to work here. I see a question.
I'm sorry. Can you define small?
No, I can't. That's a subject of, so he's asked me, for the folks online, he's asked me, can I define small business? There are technical definitions for what is, say, a mid-sized firm and that sort of thing, but the definitions are subject to some fluidity. Usually $10 million in annual revenue is kind of the cutoff, but there's also full-time equivalent employee cutoffs for that size of a firm, and it depends on the sector and that sort of thing. Manufacturing firms are small at different FTE equivalent numbers. So it's subject to some gradation, and that would be a longer conversation, but it's a really good question. But I'm focused on both small and mid-sized firms, if that makes sense. Yeah. So perfect, great. So I'd like you to think a little bit about what would happen to your business, what types of disruptions you would face if you were hit by a disaster. Now, maybe the type of business that you want to run is a textile operation where you've got workers, you've got labor, and you've got capital equipment. You've got machinery that's producing your products, and you've got a physical place, a physical plant, land that's important to how you produce your products. Even if your business wasn't physically affected, even if you didn't have physical property damage from that disaster, you could still face what we call BI, or business interruption. Your business could still be impacted because your employees could be affected. What I have up here on this picture is a picture from Superstorm Sandy of people trying to go get gas to try to get to work or to get to where they need to go after Sandy. And people showed up to try to get gas, and the pumps wouldn't work because there wasn't electricity. They had to pump them manually. And they tried to pay for their gas, and they showed up with their credit card. And how is a vendor without electricity going to take that credit card? How are you going to even get those employees to work, to the grocery store, when you don't have electricity? And your business is going to suffer significant disruptions simply because, and not simply because you've got a labor disruption, simply because your workers can't come to work. And if your operation is labor intensive and you really need your employees, how would you bounce back from that? How would you continue to operate in the absence of those employees? Another type of disruption that businesses often face are transportation disruptions. And transportation disruptions can be particularly problematic for small and mid-sized businesses. This is a picture of after the Northridge earthquake, where I grew up in Southern California. Not a pretty picture, right? What if you had to get your goods to market? Or you needed to get your intermediate inputs or your materials to produce your products, and the transportation system was out? Even if your business didn't have physical property damage, the absence of a transportation network could spell disaster for your business financially. Transportation disruptions can be particularly problematic for mid-sized businesses and small businesses. Another type of disruption are supply chain disruptions. Supply chain disruptions, we've all kind of seen those over the past few years. If I came in and gave this talk 3 years ago, most people wouldn't understand what a supply chain disruption was, but we've all kind of lived through it the last few years, right? Supply chain disruptions ripple throughout the economy, and they manifest themselves in peculiar ways for businesses. We're often familiar where I live up in the Midwest, where we see changes in the price of gas when there's a hurricane in the Gulf because of the gas and petroleum supply chain. It ripples throughout the economy, and disruptions that occur in one part of the country can have effects all throughout the supply chain, all throughout the rest of the country. And even again, if your business wasn't physically damaged with property damage, you can suffer losses in your ability to produce your goods and your services that can spell disaster for your sales revenues. And the obvious, power outages, communications disruptions. If there's down power lines, you can't turn your computers on. You can't open, in some cases, with electronic locks or bay doors to your facilities. You couldn't even open your doors. And people who have backup generators, those only last so long if you can get the fuel for them, if those were not physically damaged. Communications disruptions. You can't communicate with your workers. If you need to get your products to market and you've got drivers in a logistical operation, your communication system could be adversely affected. And these are just some of the types of disruptions that businesses see in natural disasters. You know, a few years ago, I was part of a team at Northeastern University, and we were commissioned to do a study on what would happen to interdependencies in critical infrastructure in the Boston area. Interdependencies between transportation and electric power. And you know, the stakeholders up in the Boston area were particularly concerned about what would happen if we had a Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy-like event up in Boston. It was just a few miles down the coast. And up in Boston, Boston has, is there anybody from Boston here? Nope, okay, nobody from Boston. Boston has a little bit, okay, all right. Boston has 7-foot tidal differentials. Imagine if there was a hurricane event with a 7-foot tide, right? You've got underground rail. You've got underground power lines. What would that do to your system? And one of the things we learned through that process, we surveyed stakeholders at MBTA, the people who run the T and that sort of thing. We surveyed all kinds of stakeholders and got their input. And one of the things we learned is how critically important natural gas is, natural gas lines. And what we learned is that when water gets into a natural gas line, it's really hard to get out. And once you do get it out, there's industry standards that say that you have to come back and re-inspect it at least 7 days later for a second inspection to make sure water doesn't leak back into those lines, that it doesn't sieve back in. If there's a natural gas outage, or you have some sort of water in your line, that can protract your recovery period. That can lead, in some cases, to a month or an extra month or two of just additional time waiting for inspections and for water removal before you can actually have your natural gas turned back on. Natural gas is something that we often don't think about, but it can be, especially for businesses that need it for their operation, it can be really devastating to have a natural gas disruption. So I hope it was useful and helpful to think through some of the types of disruptions that businesses would face if they were affected by a natural disaster. What you would prepare for and what you would plan for and how you would cope with that disruption. And what I want to do now is I want to shift gears and I want to define what resilience is. I want to give you some conceptual tools, help you to understand what resilience is. And I want to separate it from what resilience is often confused for, and that's mitigation. Resilience is very different from mitigation. I want to define that term for you. And I also want to give you the concept of business interruption, which we've been talking about a little bit today already. You know, there is an interesting political economy for resilience these days. Resilience is often used as a buzzword. Resilience is often used by regulated industries to have multiple meanings. And in some cases, there's a lot of money at stake for things like public utilities. They'll add riders or charges to your electric bill for resilience, and at the same time, add riders and charges to your bill for reliability. Yet they haven't really defined those terms. What does resilience mean? Well, unfortunately, resilience is often used to describe anything that reduces hazard losses. But there's a perfectly good word for actions that you take before a disaster, and that's mitigation. You know, mitigation is predominantly focused on reducing property damage losses. Those are actions that you take before the disaster strikes. But resilience, what you implement after the disaster, that didn't work. There we go. Resilience, if you think even about the root word, the Latin root word of resilience, it means to bounce back. Resilience is what you do after the disaster hits, when the disaster strikes, when that disruption affects your labor disruption or your supply chain disruption, when that disaster hits. It's not something you do previous to a disaster. Now, I acknowledge, and we acknowledge in our research, that resilience is something that you can build up capacity for before a disaster. You can buy inventories ahead of time. You can install backup generators ahead of time or install an ancillary data center ahead of time. But you don't actually turn those on or implement them until after the disaster strikes. You don't actually use those inventories. And when you do, and when you turn on that backup generator, your purpose for doing it isn't to address property damage. Your purpose for doing it is to address business interruption, losses in your ability to produce your goods and your services that impact your sales revenues. Now, let's just face it. After a disaster hits, there's almost nothing that you can do about property damage. The roof's already been blown off. Your HVAC system from high wind events has been knocked off your roof. The flooding damage has already happened. At that point, property damage is a variable that's entirely outside of your control. There's nothing that you can do to reduce property damage. At that point, that's when resilience kicks in. Resilience kicks in when the disaster strikes, and it begins all the way through at that point, and it continues all the way through until you're recovered. Resilience, a good way to think about resilience is that it's synonymous with things like business continuity, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. Resilience begins when the disaster strikes, and continues all the way through. Now, this distinction is really important for one other critically important reason. Most of our efforts at the federal level, most of agencies like FEMA and our insurance companies that help us prepare and plan for disasters, which of those two variables, property damage or business interruption, do you think they spend their time and effort preparing for? Property damage. They spend almost the entirety of their effort, almost everything you buy for insurance instruments is for property damage. It covers the damage to your physical plant or the damage to your equipment. It's not going to cover BI. You're not going to get a check for your lost sales revenues. But I'll tell you what, and I'm going to show you through our observational data collection, that business interruption losses dramatically overwhelm property damage losses in dollar terms. Yet it's the thing that's not focused on, that we're not addressing from a societal standpoint. BI is so critically important and it's so large in dollar terms, and it goes virtually ignored. I'm going to skip this slide and come right back to it. Let's look at what business interruption looked like in some recent disasters. If we look at 9/11, property damage was significant at $25 billion. But business interruption was estimated to be $100 billion. Let's look at Katrina. Katrina was a devastating disruption, $75 billion in property damage, but over $100 billion in BI losses. And only in rare situations where you don't have a strong industrial region then in your economy in the region that's affected, but really high property values, like in Southern California, do you have a situation where property damage overwhelms business interruption. So it's so important that we focus on resilience, because resilience addresses BI. It addresses the big dollar value item that we should be focusing on. I'd like to define, I'm going to go back to the previous slide I was just on, and I'd like to define two types of resilience that you should understand, particularly if you are going to run a small or mid-sized business. And that's the distinction between static resilience and dynamic resilience. Static resilience refers to the ability of a system to maintain function when it's shocked. Static resilience is all about coping, what you do with your remaining resources after you're shocked, after you're hit by that disaster. How do you continue to operate efficiently when 50% of your employees can't come into work? Static resilience, in terms of its economic definition, refers to the efficient use of remaining resources at a given point in time to produce as much as possible. It's about doing the most you can with what you have left, with what is not damaged or disrupted. It's about coping. And dynamic resilience, dynamic, if you think about that word dynamic, it really kind of conveys a sense of time. Dynamic refers to the recovery path of resilience. Dynamic refers to how quickly you recover. And dynamic resilience is all about the speed of a system, the ability of a system or of a small business or a mid-sized business to recover and get back on its feet. Dynamic resilience asks the question, how quickly you get back on your feet. And static resilience asks you the question of how you cope with that disruption. Dynamic resilience involves things like investment in replacing capital that was damaged, investment in getting employees to come back into the office when they had to move away because of the disaster, hiring new folks, investments in technology upgrades, replacing old computers that were damaged with new computers and that sort of thing. Dynamic resilience is all about taking money that you would otherwise have spent on your plant or equipment and using that, taking that opportunity cost to invest in hastening your recovery. And both types of resilience are important. But generally speaking, resilience is synonymous with efficient business continuity. And if there's a synonym that you'd like to use to refer to resilience for businesses, business continuity is a pretty good one. How do we continue our business and operate with the disruptions that we faced? And the way we typically measure resilience is in terms of sales revenue losses, how that business has done in terms of its impact on its ability to produce its goods and its services. And we measure that with its in terms of sales revenue. We've all been through the pandemic lately, right? Hopefully it's behind us. And we're all thinking about our immune systems these days. One good synonym for you, one good kind of way to think about resilience is it's kind of like the immune system for your business. How well you're a business when it's shocked or attacked by a virus or a hurricane, how well it bounces back, how well it fights off and defends with the available resources that it has. And that's so important for small and mid-sized businesses. What are some, oh, we already covered this one. There we go. What are some practical things that your business can do to engage or implement resilience actions? And the academic literature, including case studies of real life businesses, both in economic resilience and in supply chain resilience, generally identifies 11 classes or actions or classes of actions or tactics that businesses can implement to reduce BI losses and disasters. And these are things like use of inventories. These are things like replacing domestically sourced products that are no longer available because of the disaster with imports. These are things like production recapture, running extra shifts to make up for lost production. These are things like setting up alternative sourcing arrangements, recontracting or selective exchange of resources, partnerships and joint ventures, so that if you do have a disruption to your supply chain or your intermediate products, you can collaborate with a partner agency or a partner business to get those resources. One of the things we often see, not necessarily in the private sector, but in regulated industries like utilities, when we have power lines down in Houston from a major disaster like Harvey, who goes down to Harvey and helps out with the restoration of those power systems? All of the local utilities send their excess linemen and workers down to those places to help them get back up. They have cooperative agreements to get those resources to those locations, to those impact centers, so that they can get those lines back up and restored. And that's a really important type of resilience tactic, resource pooling. And you know what, you guys here at Ohio State, forgive me, here at North Dakota State, you guys have a professor who was at Ohio State, Alfredo Roa Henriquez, who actually invented that tactic, or rather defined that tactic and brought it into the lexicon of this research. And he's going to be giving a talk here in a couple of weeks. And I hope you'll be able to go to his talk. And he's a collaborator with me on these projects. Really important resource pooling. So let's talk about some of our observational data collection. I want to talk about some surveys that we ran that were funded by Homeland Security to go out and measure resilience, to ask businesses that were impacted by disasters how they coped with and how they maintained business continuity and what they did to essentially bounce back from those disruptions or from those disasters. This is a picture of downtown Houston after Hurricane Harvey. I went to downtown Houston a few months after Harvey hit for the annual Energy Economics Association meetings. And even on the high freeways, there's like 3 loops of the Beltway system there, if you're familiar with the Houston area. And the freeway is elevated in some cases about 20 to 25 feet high. And there were sand dunes still from the ocean in Houston on the Beltway. It was a really devastating disaster. And so what we did is we surveyed firms that were affected by Hurricane Harvey and firms that were affected by Superstorm Sandy. And we did 2 randomized samples in each of those populations, in New York and New Jersey for Sandy, and in Houston and all throughout Texas for Harvey. We administered our surveys at 60 and 13 months post-disaster, respectively. We wanted to give those businesses enough time, enough window of opportunity with their recovery path to get a sense of what resilience actions they implemented, what sorts of business interruptions they experienced. Did they have supply chain disruptions, or did they have labor disruptions and that sort of thing? And so we gave them a nice window of opportunity. interesting finding from our work and from some of our surveys that we've done, even though Harvey was a much more devastating disaster, Harvey was a Category 5. It was the most devastating natural hazard in US history. Superstorm Sandy wasn't even a Category 1 hurricane. It was a superstorm. Yet businesses in New York and New Jersey took about 2.49 years to recover on average. They took about 7 to 11 months, give or take, in Texas. The type of economy and the type of businesses dramatically influence their recovery path. We stratified our sample by firm size so that we had a nice mix of businesses that were small and large. We stratified it to make sure we had a nice mix of different types of businesses. We had transportation sector firms, we had service sector firms, we had manufacturing firms, and we tried to get a nice representative sample of the economy. And we made sure that we stratified our sample by both business interruption and property damage, so that we had a nice mix of businesses that didn't just have business interruption, but also had physical damage, physical disruption. So we had about 62% of our sample had both BI and property damage. And if you want to think about the types of businesses that we got in our sample, the typical firm at the median had 30 employees. Now our mean was about 2,700 employees. And you think to your statistics classes, what does it ever look like when your mean is higher than your median? Well, what we had is some really large firms in our database. We had a couple of 90,000 employee firms, particularly in the New York and New Jersey area. So, but if you think about the typical type of business that I'm going to be talking about here, it's going to be that small to mid-sized business in the 30 or so, 30 to 50 employee range, okay? And our sample size was about 250 firms, using just about 1,000 resilience tactics or resilience actions that we could measure. Now, if you think about this, 250 doesn't sound like a very large sample size. Post-disaster surveys are some of the most difficult and challenging surveys to run, particularly in business. And most of the academic literature has sample sizes in the 90 to 110 range. So we're pretty proud of our sample size at 250 or so firms. Let's talk about what we're measuring with these surveys. How do we quantify resilience? And the way we measure resilience, the way we quantify resilience are with resilience metrics, tools that we can use to quantify and measure the ability of a system to cope and how effectively and cost effectively it maintains its business continuity and avoids losses associated with business interruption. The first resilience metric for you to think about is the RM. This is the resilience metric. It's been in the literature, the academic literature, for about 20 years now. And it's a really tractable metric. It's in percent terms. And it's the ratio of what we call avoided losses to maximum potential losses. What does that mean? Avoided losses are losses in sales revenue that your firm did not observe because you took some proactive action to reduce those losses in sales revenues. You installed a backup generator and then turned it on and implemented it. You used inventories that you had previously purchased. You authorized a second shift and you paid your workers time and a half or double time to come in and work a second shift to make up for lost production. You purchased additional resources or supplementary resources from a resource pooling arrangement. You engaged in some specific action intended to reduce those sales revenue losses. And those are the avoided losses. How many dollars of losses did you not actually observe because you took proactive steps to cope and to have business continuity? And the divisor there, the denominator, is maximum potential losses. Maximum potential losses are the losses that your business would have experienced if you did nothing, if you didn't implement that given resilience tactic or that given set of resilience tactics. What would your sales revenues have been had you not really done anything? If you sat on your hands and just kind of waited for things to happen or waited for that insurance check to come in? And if you think about it, if you take the numerator and denominator, we can measure those two in percent change terms. So let's say, for example, your firm has a resilience metric of 0.08. What does that mean? It means that that your firm avoided 8% of its maximum potential losses in sales revenue because you implemented a resilience action or a resilience tactic. And it's a really tractable metric because it's comparable between firms in different sectors, and it's comparable across firms of different sizes. It's in percent terms. The next metric that we use to evaluate and measure and quantify resilience is what's called the BCR, or the benefit cost ratio. And those of you who have taken classes like benefit cost analysis, you're familiar with this metric. This is a ratio metric of bang for buck, inputs to outputs. What were your avoided losses as a function of how much you spent to avoid those losses? The denominator is your cost of implementing that given resilience tactic. Let's say, for example, your business avoided a significant amount of losses in sales revenue, but it cost you a ton of money to authorize that second shift. Your employees, you have to pay them double time, or there's a union agreement that makes it expensive, or there's increases in fringe or healthcare costs associated with doing that. And the costs associated with implementing that resilience tactic can in some cases be not necessarily trivial. They can be a large number. And in some cases, the resilience metric, the benefit cost ratio can be a very small number. Let's say, for example, a firm has a BCR of 8.2. What does that mean? That means for every dollar that firm spent implementing a given resilience tactic, it avoided $8.20 in losses. That's an 8-to-1 return. That's a really good thing. If you have a BCR that's less than 1, what does that mean? Well, a BCR less than 1 means that for every dollar you spent, maybe if it was, you got less back, right? Maybe it was 0.5. For every dollar you spent implementing a tactic, you only avoided 50 cents in losses. So a BCR tells you whether or not a given resilience tactic is worthwhile to you. And if you think about the question I posed when we first started, you've got to ask yourself that question. Is it worth it to me and to my business to implement a resilience tactic? Is it something that I'm going to do? I think it's going to help my business bounce back. I think it's going to help us continue to operate, but you have no idea if you're going to spin your wheels and go nowhere. If you're going to put your effort and all of your eggs into authorizing that second shift, and it turns out to be a net loss to you financially. The benefit cost ratio is an important resilience metric. Let's talk about some results from our surveys. Let's look at some results from how businesses were impacted by these disasters and how we quantified these metrics for businesses. What I'm showing you here is a graphic or a bar chart that has each of our sectors of the economy that were impacted by these disasters broken down into a 6-sectoring scheme, where you can kind of see manufacturing next to fire, finance, insurance, and real estate, transportation, communication, utilities, and that sort of thing. And what I have on the y-axis here is the percentage of the losses that firm experienced in business interruption that were due to each of those sources of disruption. And what you can see is, well, I guess it kind of makes a lot of intuitive sense. For most businesses, labor is really important. If your employees can't get to work, or they're off attending to their families, or even if they're just attending to their kids because the school is closed, if your employees can't get to work, it's a significant portion of your business interruption. Supply chain disruptions can be particularly problematic. Wholesale and retail trade, I think that makes obvious sense, tremendously impacted by supply chain disruptions. Finance, insurance, and real estate, similarly. Power outages, transportation disruptions impact the capital-intensive sectors, the manufacturing sectors. Water outages, not so common, I suppose, in a hurricane. You can make the joke there if you'd like. Let's look at, on aggregate, in those results from our surveys, how business interruption compared to property damage losses in dollars. What I'm showing you now are the dollar values of business interruption versus property damage for Superstorm Sandy. And what we can see in our sample, if you look just at the firms that had physical property damage, At the median, the median firm had $100,000 in property damage, but $180,000 in business interruption losses. And if we include the firms that had business interruption but no property damage, we have $25,000 at the median in property damage losses and $100,000 in BI losses. If we look at Hurricane Harvey, the median firm with property damage had $56,000 in property damage losses. And if we include all firms, including the firms that had losses in just BI and not necessarily property damage, that number drops to $5,000. And business interruption losses among firms with property damage was $725,000. That's anywhere between a 400 and a 12,000% ratio. And what we found overall across our sample is that business interruption is about 900% larger than property damage for businesses in dollar terms. 900%. And yet the majority of our effort and what we insure ourselves against is for property damage. BI to property damage matters. How many resilience tactics does the typical business implement after a disaster? Typically, what we found is that the typical firm implements anywhere between 2 and 4 resilience actions. It makes common sense that the more actions that they implement, the greater their avoided losses were. But what we find is that the firms that had property damage implemented greater numbers of tactics, and I think that makes common sense. But the firms that are more capital intensive, like transportation, communications, and utilities, those types of firms had the greatest numbers of tactics. They're the most capital intensive and labor intensive sectors, and they had the ability to implement greater numbers of tactics to avoid those losses. Let's look at our metric results for our benefit cost ratio, our BCR metric, and our RM metric. So if you look at our Superstorm Sandy sample, on net across our entire sample of businesses, firms avoided about a little bit more than $57 million in sales revenue losses. But they spent a little bit more than $12 million to avoid those losses. And on average, in our Sandy sample, that gives firms a net benefit cost ratio of about 476 to 1. In Hurricane Harvey, firms spent about $6.5 million to avoid about $27 million in losses. And our net benefit cost ratio pooled across our two samples is 457 to 1. In other words, for every dollar that businesses spent implementing resilience actions designed to reduce business interruption losses, they avoided $4.57. That's an average aggregate economy-wide number. Some businesses did much better. Some businesses had BCRs of 27 to 1. Some businesses had BCRs below 1. They put a lot of effort, time, and money into actions that got them almost nowhere. And it depends on how impactful that resilience action was and how effectively it was implemented. Let's look at our resilience metric results, our RM. The net maximum potential losses in Sandy, 167 million. In total in our sample, net max potential losses are 1.3 million. Hurricane Harvey was a much more devastating disaster. Firms only avoided a little bit more than 2% of their max potential losses through implementing resilience tactics or resilience actions. Not a whole lot of resilience and not a whole lot of tactics available to them. Superstorm Sandy, firms were able to avoid a little bit more than a third of their sales revenue losses. In total, we find that resilience gives us, in these two disasters, a little bit more than 6% avoided losses. Now imagine if businesses had access to data through, say, a large database that would give them access to all sorts of information that would help them understand what they could and what they wouldn't have to, what they could do effectively to address and implement the most impactful and cost-effective tactics. What if this is 2022, right, guys? We should have something like this. And that's what we did. We developed, through Homeland Security, we developed a statistical software, a decision support tool called the Business Resilience Calculator that was designed to help businesses make these sorts of decisions. If you're a business that was impacted by a disaster, you can go to the business resilience calculator and match up your firm based on the type of sector that you're in. Maybe you're in transportation, or you're in the finance sector, or whatever sector you're in. You can take your business and match it up to all kinds of other businesses like your business and get great metrics, statistically significant metrics for your business to help you identify what resilience actions are going to be impactful, and what resilience metrics are going to be, or excuse me, what resilience tactics are going to be impactful, and which resilience tactics are going to be cost effective. The business resilience calculator is, we've gone through the technology commercialization process with Homeland Security over the last 18 months or so, and the software is up online at resiliencecalculator.com, and we're going through the patenting process with US PTO right now. I'm going to do a quick demo in the few minutes that we have available and show you what the BRC looks like. And I've got one of our colleagues in the back who's running a computer right now, and he's going to toggle over to the BRC and show you what it looks like, so you can kind of see what the business resilience calculator looks like. And we really designed this software for agencies like FEMA, agencies like Homeland Security, as well as insurance companies, so they can provide, and Small Business Administration, Economic Development Administration, EDA, to let them have a tool at their disposal so that they can go ahead and advise and counsel businesses that were hit by a disaster, what they can do to cost effectively cope with that disaster. And what we have here is, I've just got kind of a demo account created for a manufacturing firm, on the larger side of mid-size manufacturing firm with about 800 million in annual sales revenues. Alfredo, can you go ahead and select hurricane? Oh, you've already got that selected. Perfect. So when you log in, you get to select a scenario, a type of disaster, a type of disruption. And we're going to begin by just selecting, let's just pick hurricane. And you select the type of disaster that you'd like to prepare and plan for. And there's two modules to the business resilience calculator. There's a prospective module and a retrospective module. And I'll show you both modules briefly in the time that we have remaining. This is the prospective module. So this is designed for businesses that are looking prospectively into the future to evaluate which resilience actions they'd like to be able to be prepared for, so that they can implement and instrument those resilience tactics when the disaster hits. The next stage of the BRC, you select the types of disruptions that you'd like to prepare and plan for. Maybe they're labor disruptions. Maybe there's supply chain disruptions. Maybe there's power outages or water outages or transportation disruptions. And you can toggle these percentages up and down to account for different scenarios that your business would like to prepare and plan for. So we can go ahead and leave these, Alfredo, at the default level there. And then you select property damage. Property damage can play a role in your ability to implement resilience tactics. And you can account for scenarios where you have just business interruption or business interruption and property damage. Oh, that's okay. The next stage is where you select which resilience tactics you'd like to see metrics for. Would you like to see the benefit cost ratio for inventories, or for production recapture, or relocation? And you can select cost incurring as well as cost saving tactics. In some rare cases, resilience tactics can be implemented at a cost savings. Things like conservation efforts can actually have negative costs to implement. They can be cost saving. And so we have metrics for those cost saving tactics as well. And the BRC allows users to have results for up to 3 tactics at a time. And when you select, there you go, you get results that will pop up for you. And it's going to calculate based on the observations in a large database. And it's going to give you a full distribution of each of our metrics. So right now it's prioritized and rank ordered. Let's see what we've got up there. Right now it's given us production recapture, making up for running extra shifts. And it tells you, let's just leave that one up for a second, Alfredo. Perfect. Production recapture. So it tells us that at the median, firms just like yours, matched to your sector, matched to your firm size and the type of disruptions that you're preparing and planning for, the median firm avoided $1.30 in sales revenue losses for every dollar it spent implementing that resilience action or that resilience tactic. And let's say, for example, before your board authorizes the running of a second shift that's potentially costly, or there's union limitations on authorizing a second shift. They say, you know what, we need to have at least a 3-to-1 return before we think it's worthwhile for us to implement that tactic. Well, we could click on 3 anywhere on there, and it'll calculate the integral for us. It'll give us the area under the curve or the probability associated with that BCR being obtained. And let's say, for example, we want to see all the different metrics for that given tactic. We're really interested in running extra shifts with production recapture. We can look at all of our different resilience metrics side by side and use kind of comparative analytics to be able to evaluate which resilience actions or tactics we want to put into our resilience action plan, into our recovery plan. And then after that, let's say, for example, your business has already been through a disaster. Let's say, for example, your business has a lived experience and you'd like to see what your own metrics were. How well did you fare in that last disaster? Well, we have another module called the retrospective module. Alfredo, let's go ahead and pull it on down to the retrospective. And you can select a button there to go to the retrospective module. And after filling out a short survey that you give us information that help us understand what you went through in your disaster, what I have here is a situation where a business had a 5-month shutdown from COVID-19. They didn't have any business interruption. They had 300 employees before COVID-19, but during COVID, they had 200 employees. So they had basically a 100 employee reduction. And they had some significant business interruption losses. And they used 3 resilience tactics that I placed in here. Again, this is just hypothetical. It's not built within the database. It's not going to affect anything by running this as a scenario. And so they used 2 resilience tactics: inventories and technological change. Can you pop up a little bit, Alfredo, to the disruptions? We have 3 disruptions there. 1, government decree, when there's a mandate of a shutdown for your business. And that was a significant portion, 50% of their business interruption. Another proportion of their business interruption was due to supply chain disruptions, and some of it from a labor disruption, kind of emblematic of the experience of a lot of businesses over the past couple of years. And after you fill in some information that allows us to calculate things like your avoided losses, you can go ahead and click submit there, Alfredo. And at the end, it's going to give you tailor-made results just for your lived experience. And it's going to put those out onto the same graphical plots next to the other businesses in your sector. So you can compare to other businesses just like yours, in this case, manufacturing, with the same employee size, about 200 or 300 employees. And you can click anywhere on those graphics and it'll calculate for you the probability of obtaining that benefit cost ratio. You can see what percentile your business was in. So you can know, for example, that your business was in the 50th or 90th percentile. You did really well compared to other businesses, or you did really poorly. And then you can learn from your experience and improve yourself for next time. Hopefully there is no next time, but you can learn from that experience and grow and adapt. And as new users continue to use the software, the database continues to learn and update and grow, and businesses can use this software to inform how they prepare and plan for disasters to come. I'm going to go ahead and conclude with that, guys. Thank you so much for having me today. It's been a privilege to be here. Thank you. I'll take some questions in the remaining time that we have.
Yeah, so I didn't tell Noah that there's classes, so if people have to go to class, by all means, go to your next class, but otherwise we'll begin to answer questions.
Great. Yes, please. Oh, great question. You know, I don't, I'm not going to say which resilience strategies or tactics are least cost effective or least effective. One of the things that we have found, though, is that in some cases, resilience actions or resilience tactics can be exhaustive. They can be really cost effective up to a certain point. They'll get you maybe, and which is why we have another metric on there that I didn't talk about today called the RCE, or the Resilience Cost Effectiveness Metric. And what that metric does is it allows you to identify investment targets. If you wanted to get to a 15% RM with this tactic, how much would you need to spend in $1,000 units? And it would tell you how much you would need to spend in that tactic. So it would kind of give you a sense of how much effort, time, and of course, money you would have to spend in that tactic to get to that level of avoided losses. And so one of the things that we found is that in some resilience actions or some resilience tactics, they're really cost effective at small levels of avoided losses, but to get to larger levels of avoided losses, there's almost some nonlinearities there. So great question. Great question. Thank you. Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
So I wonder, like, how long the business like start doing something to recover?
Yeah.
Like, one company they call for a while, for 1, 2.
Great question. Great question. Yeah, great question. So there's some research that one of our co-authors at USC, Adam Rose, and one of his other co-authors put together about 3 years ago in the journal Risk Analysis, and they asked this very question. And what they found is that what businesses do in the immediate aftermath of their disruptions sets the pace for the rest of their recovery period. What you do initially, it sets up a pattern of growth or a pattern of recovery for you that essentially sets your recovery path slope. And once you set that growth pattern with a high level of productivity, you have a quick or rapid start, your business, statistically speaking, is going to have a much better chance of recovery and a much greater chance of a cost-effective recovery. So one of the things that we find is that the decisions that businesses make in the early aftermath of a disaster is of critical importance to businesses. And this is also important for government. Government should be doing something after a disaster to help businesses recover and rebound, to give them the resources that they need, particularly on the infrastructure side, as well as on the financing side, to help them make those decisions in terms of what to do in the aftermath of the disaster as quickly as possible. When government delays and it affects businesses' ability to make those early decisions, it can be devastating. What we saw with Superstorm Sandy is that the government delayed quite a bit. People didn't get their checks that were promised to them at the podium during a presidential election. They didn't get those checks for a long time, right? After Hurricane Harvey, businesses saw an immediate response from FEMA and from other agencies, and it helped businesses make that decision to rebound and what to do in terms of their instrumentation of resilience tactics very promptly and very quickly, and their recovery path was much faster. So there's also an important public policy component to your question as well that I think we can all appreciate. So great question. Great question. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes.
So help me understand. You looked at resilience, not mitigation.
Correct. We did not look at mitigation. One of our other co-authors, again, Adam Rose at USC, was the lead economic author on a National Academy study, the famous Mitigation Saves study. And it was a study that quantified that number that I showed you, the benefit cost ratio for mitigation. And they came to a number of 6-to-1 for mitigation. So they found that mitigation, for every $1 spent on mitigation, you avoid $6 in losses in business interruption. We believe that our number for resilience at 457-to-1, again, that's an aggregate number, not tailored to any particular firm, is a really conservative estimate. There's other estimates out there that are much higher and I think unbelievable. I think our number is pretty conservative. So there are other studies that do mitigation, but mitigation was not the focus of our research.
So
yes.
Earlier on you had the ratio, the SCAR ratio.
Yes.
Were you looking at immediate loss of sales, or were you also looking at long-term lost sales? For example, you can't deliver to a customer cancel their contracts
Yeah.
for the future and start using a given competitor.
Yes, great question. What we did for our survey and for our quantification was we looked at the period of time at which that business defined as its own recovery period between when the disaster first impacted them and when they defined themselves to have been completely recovered. In some cases in our sample, we have businesses that hadn't yet recovered by the time we implemented the survey. And at that point, we would have cut off that timing at that point in time. But for the bulk of our respondents, it would have been the businesses that had all of those impacts already accounted for in their full recovery window. So hopefully that answers your question.
Great help. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks. Let's go with one more.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.